Welcome to FRESHImage. FRESHImage is a non-profit Catholic ministry committed to providing individuals and communities with resources to facilitate the full flourishing of the image of God in each and every single human person. Not only will you find hundreds of articles, convenient audios, and presentations on our beautiful faith, but also catechetical resources to be used in the classroom, at the parish, and at the kitchen table. Today, we are happy to present FRESHImage Gospel Reflections from our founder, Tony Crescio. Tony reminds us that it is when we look into the mirror of Scripture that we discover the unique image of God we have each been created to be.
My dear friends in Christ, a very blessed and Merry Christmas to you all. Today, we celebrate the feast of the Holy Family of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. This beautiful feast of the Church is typically celebrated on the Sunday within the Octave of Christmas, the days spanning from Christmas Day to New Year's Eve, which is also the day of anticipation for the celebration of the Solemnity of Mary, the Mother of God, on New Year's Day. By placing this beautiful feast within the great octave of Christmas, then, the Church enshrines it with great solemnity. And while the reasons for celebrating this feast may seem self-evident, I think it important to begin by asking the obvious question. Why do we celebrate the feast of the Holy Family of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph at this time? On a very practical level, we could answer our question in a very basic yet reasonable way by saying that now is the most appropriate time to celebrate the life of the Holy Family because Jesus has just been born, and thus, his presence outside the womb demands that family life in its everyday lived reality commences at this point. In short, now everyone sees the lived reality of this family, constituted by Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. While reasonable, this answer is not very satisfying for at least a couple of reasons. First, such an answer ignores the fact that both Mary and Joseph, as all expectant parents do, had been coming to terms with the reality of their family life for 9 months. Jesus' virginal conception made this even more difficult than in normal circumstances, of course. Mary asked the angel Gabriel how this would happen, since she knew not man, and Joseph assumed it had happened by another man until an angel tells him that Jesus had been conceived by the Holy Spirit. The difficulties present from the very moment of Jesus' conception make it obvious that, for Mary and Joseph, their family life, together with some inclination of the trials and hardships it might bring, was very real to them for some time now. As is evident, in great part, what made the life of the Holy Family more complex and difficult than usual comes from Jesus' identity as the incarnate Son of God, which points to the second reason our first answer isn't very satisfying. Namely, although the rest of the world now saw a complete family, father, mother, and son, appearances were deceiving in some sense, as is emphasized by our gospel reading for today. For Joseph is not Jesus' biological father. Thus, we ought to continue to look for a deeper answer as to why the Feast of the Holy Family is celebrated today. Our collect for today's liturgy answers our question in a similarly straightforward manner. O God, who are pleased to give us the shining example of the Holy Family, graciously grant that we may imitate them in practicing the virtues of family life and in the bonds of charity, and so, in the joy of your house, delight one day in eternal rewards. In the Holy Family, we are given an example of family life to imitate, such that we grow in holiness precisely by that imitation. Okay, now we have a better answer, but how we interpret and understand that answer is very important. For, at this point, we can interpret this answer in ways that leave us with an incomplete understanding, both of which revolve around our understanding of the Holy Family as an example that God has placed before us. The first way is to interpret the Holy Family's exemplarity as consisting in merely their familial structure, to see them as exemplary because their family consists of a father, mother, and a child. To be sure, especially in our own time and place, this is something that bears mentioning, simply because the traditional family is under such intense attack. Thus, while the Holy Family is exemplary in the sense that it exemplifies the ideal family structure, because this is the familial structure best suited to the full flourishing of all individuals involved, it is important not to see this as a complete understanding of their exemplarity. A second temptation that follows from seeing the Holy Family's exemplarity merely in their familial structure is to understand their lives in an idealistic manner. Rather, even as we recognize the Holy Family as an ideal or exemplum to imitate, we must take care not to see their lives idealistically. To do so would severely undermine the humanness of their family life precisely because it fails to recognize its difficulty and messiness. The life of the Holy Family was not that depicted in stained glass. Instead, as today's gospel passage makes obvious, the life of the Holy Family was an adventure, an adventurous pursuit of holiness in love. Adventure is an altogether appropriate word to describe the pursuit of and growth in holiness by cooperating with God's grace. The word adventure is etymologically related to the word Advent, which of course is the word used to name the liturgical season of preparation leading up to Christmas. While the popular connotation of the word adventure is a sort of thrilling pursuit involving chance or risk, the word adventure finds its roots in the Latin advenire, which means to come to reach, or arrive at. I would suggest the pursuit of holiness involves both meanings. The pursuit of holiness is anything but a clean and orderly process, from our perspective at least. We can make our best plans to grow in holiness, involving daily, weekly, and monthly routines, and are likely to find that life's circumstances force us to adjust those plans continually. This is not to say planning is useless, far from it. Planning and goal setting is a necessity when it comes to growth in holiness. It is to say, however, that whatever plans we make must be open to reading the signs of the times, to borrow a phrase from the Second Vatican Council, and that on a daily basis. Even a short-term illness in one's family can mean adjusting one's daily prayer routines, and thus one's path to holiness can momentarily shift in emphasis from more time spent in prayer to more emphasis on works of mercy, in the form of taking the time to care for another's physical needs, making a meal, running a warm bath, fetching some medicine from the pharmacy, and the like. Such a shift in emphasis does not mean the process of growing in holiness stops. Rather, the path to holiness takes an unforeseen turn, and we must be able to adjust to what providence allows to be placed before us, and then allow God's grace to use whatever circumstances we face to draw us closer to Him. I take it that this is something along the lines of what St. Paul had in mind when he wrote in chapter 8, verse 28 of his letter to the Romans that we know that all things work for good for those who love God, who are called according to His purpose. Trusting that God uses every circumstance to draw us closer to Him is central to the idea of the adventure of holiness. We see the lived expression of an adventurous faith in our gospel reading for today, chapter 2, verses 41 to 52 of the Gospel according to St. Luke, which recounts the episode of the child Jesus lost and found in the temple. The episode is familiar enough to us, especially if we regularly pray the Rosary, as it is the fifth and final of the joyful mysteries. In St. Luke's Gospel, this episode follows the recounting of the presentation of Jesus in the temple, with only 2 verses intervening between the episodes. These 2 verses are important for seeing the adventure of holiness St. Luke is depicting for us. In verses 39 to 40 of chapter 2, Luke writes, "When they had fulfilled the prescriptions of the law of the Lord, namely, to consecrate every male that opens the womb to the Lord, by the sacrifice of a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. The child Jesus grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. By sandwiching these two verses between the episodes of the presentation at the temple and the child Jesus lost and found at the temple, St. Luke is pointing out three elements constitutive of the adventure of holiness that are re-emphasized by today's gospel. First, Jesus was raised in a family whose life was centered on God and focused on growing closer to Him, meaning they actively pursued holiness. Second, holiness is a matter of growth, as much as, if not more than, a state one reaches, especially this side of eternity, making the pursuit of holiness adventure by definition. Third, by making Jesus' family life and his process of growing in wisdom and physical stature a central part of his account of Jesus' early years, St. Luke is highlighting the fullness of Jesus' humanity. However, as we will see in our gospel for today, Luke highlights Jesus' humanity precisely as incarnate Son of God in a manner that points towards the development of the Church's doctrine of the hypostatic union. That the active pursuit of holiness was part and parcel of the life of the Holy Family is evident from the opening verses of today's gospel. In verses 41 to 42 of chapter 2, Luke tells us, each year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up according to festival custom. Luke is also highlighting the humanness of Jesus' life in these verses, reporting as fact that Mary and Joseph were Jesus' parents, a point that needs nuancing and will be subsequently. Luke's next two verses likewise highlight the humanness of Jesus' life by allowing us to see that it included the messiness that we too find ourselves in occasionally. In verses 43 to 44, Luke writes, after they had completed its days, as they were returning, the boy Jesus remained behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Thinking that he was in the caravan, they journeyed for a day and looked for him among their relatives and acquaintances. Luke's Greek here symbolically highlights the idea of adventure once again, specifically its nature as a journey. What is translated into English as caravan is the Greek synodia, which carries the technical meaning of pilgrim community. Although not immediately present with them, Mary and Joseph assume Jesus is traveling among this synodia. At this point, we might be thinking that we are being put on by the evangelist, for there is no way, we might think, that Mary and Joseph would have lost track of the Son of God incarnate. We might think, if we were them, we would have never let Jesus out of our sight. But you see, that's sort of the point. To be sure, Jesus was raised in a pious and devout Jewish household, but as a normal child. This is something pointed out by the late great Joseph Ratzinger in his work, Jesus of Nazareth, The Infancy Narratives. Discussing our gospel passage for today, Ratzinger writes, given our perhaps unduly narrow image of the Holy Family, we might find this surprising, but it illustrates very beautifully that in the Holy Family, freedom and obedience were combined in a healthy manner. The 12-year-old Jesus was free to spend time with friends and children his own age, and to remain in their company during this journey. Naturally, his parents expected to see him when evening came. We glean two more important characteristics of the adventure of holiness in Ratzinger's words, freedom and obedience. Because holiness is a matter of growing in relationship with God, it must be free if it is to be authentic. Authentic relationship can never be coerced. Moreover, because holiness is a matter of becoming the completely unique image of God we have each been created to be, obedience to God's creational intention for the human creature, namely perfect communion with Him, is necessary. When night came, however, Mary and Joseph did not find Jesus among the pilgrim community as they had expected. Okay, This is where the messiness of human life is highlighted. Any parent who has thought that they have lost their child, even momentarily, knows exactly what Mary and Joseph are feeling right now. Extreme anxiety and perhaps panic. There can be no question that as they traveled back to Jerusalem to look for Jesus there, Mary and Joseph feared the worst, feared that something horrible had happened to Jesus. Mary tells Jesus as much later on. For thankfully, they do find the child Jesus after much searching. In verse 46, Luke tells us, after 3 days, they found Jesus in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. The timeline given by St. Luke here can be understood both literally and as having figural import. The 3-day timeline simply makes sense. Mary and Joseph journeyed for a day away from Jerusalem, demanding another day's journey back to Jerusalem, and then another day of searching for Jesus in the city and finding him in the temple on the 3rd day. Figuratively, of course, the 3-day timeline already points ahead to Jesus' 3 days in the tomb, a time when he is unseen by those closest to him who, like Mary and Joseph, fear and believe the worst to have happened to Jesus. What happens next can likewise be interpreted within a death and resurrection dynamic, which thus reveals itself as another characteristic of the adventure of holiness. But I want to flag something else noted by St. Luke in verses 46 to 47 first. When Mary and Joseph found Jesus in the temple, he was sitting in the midst of the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions, and all who heard him were astounded at his understanding and his answers. We might gloss over these verses and assume Jesus was holding court here, that in fact he was the one teaching. The problem with this interpretation is that it undermines Jesus' full humanity, which the evangelist's account does not do. For while Luke makes Jesus' precocious intellect clear, that is not what he reports. Rather, Jesus was more in a give-and-take situation with the teachers. We can imagine him asking the teachers questions and then responding in a manner that clarified things for him or proceeded to the necessary consequent of what he had been taught. And it was these clarifying responses or deductive conclusions that revealed his intelligence at a young age. Jesus' interaction with the teachers thus points out 2 more characteristics that are a necessary part of the adventure of holiness. If we are to make this adventure, we must be humble and meek, as Jesus exemplifies here and as he teaches in the Beatitudes. We must be humble enough to know that we don't know everything about human life, or worse, assume learning is unnecessary, for we can define life as we see fit, which is a defining mark of the vice of pride. But we must also be meek along with being humble, for meekness gives us the ability to be teachable, to be willing to listen and learn. It is this scene that Mary and Joseph happen upon in the temple. In verse 48, Luke tells us, when his parents saw him, they were astounded, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been looking for you with great anxiety." In this verse, Jesus' humanity is once again highlighted, for Mary describes herself as his mother and Joseph as his father. And to be sure, this is how Jesus would have lived day to day. But Jesus' response draws the mystery of the incarnation to center stage. In verse 49, the boy Jesus responds, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? I am in my Father's house," Jesus says, "for I am in the temple, the house of God." From a young age, then, Jesus exemplifies the free obedience requisite of the adventure of holiness for us, which must have relationship with God as its focus. A free obedience he ultimately enables us to have by accomplishing our salvation upon the cross and opening the gates of divine grace for us. Mary and Joseph's response to what Jesus says is where we see the death and resurrection dynamic mentioned earlier. In verse 50, St. Luke tells us, "But Mary and Joseph did not understand what he said to them." In the infant and child Jesus, Mary and Joseph saw their beloved son, and to be sure he was. And so to hear Jesus remind them that their family home was not his first home must have been emotionally difficult and confusing to Mary and Joseph. Jesus is not being rude to the human parents God the Father entrusted him to, however. Instead, Jesus is reminding Mary and Joseph of his mission and ultimately of their central role in helping him accomplish the salvation of the world by helping raise him on a human level. Jesus is reminding them they all must be focused on the mission God the Father has sent his only begotten Son to accomplish. And so, we might say, a death takes place within the hearts and minds of Mary and Joseph here, for they must let go, to some degree, of their beloved Son, Jesus. And they do so willingly. In verse 51, Luke tells us that Mary kept all these things in her heart, meaning she contemplated them and sought deeper understanding, the deeper understanding of God and his salvific action, constitutive of growth in holiness and thus resurrected life on a higher plane. You see, Mary, and we can freely presume Joseph, are, like Jesus, humble and meek. They do not understand everything, but are willing to learn. Further emphasizing these two all-important virtues of human life, Luke closes the episode by telling us that Jesus went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. And Jesus advanced in wisdom and age and favor before God and man. St. Luke is screaming the reality of the incarnation of God's only begotten Son to us at this point. For Luke says, Jesus went down with Mary and Joseph to Nazareth. With respect to altitude, this is correct, for Nazareth sits about 1,000 feet lower than Jerusalem. However, if we think geographically, there is a clear figural connotation here. For while lower altitudinally, Nazareth is not south of Jerusalem, but north thereof. Jesus went down with Mary and Joseph. As the incarnate Son, he lived as the son of a human mother and foster father, who Jesus respected and treated as his father on earth. In all of this, Jesus includes one final characteristic of the adventure of holiness for us this Sunday. For, while Jesus makes clear that his love for God and the mission God the Father has entrusted to him take priority above all, Jesus grows in wisdom and favor before God and man by living God's fourth commandment to honor one's father and mother to the full. Thus, Jesus makes clear to us that when it comes to the adventure of holiness, we only make progress by living out the twofold command to love God above all and neighbor as self in that order. My friends, on this great feast of the Holy Family, we are provided with a brief yet intense lesson on the adventure of holiness by Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. For starters, we can say that the life of the human creature this side of eternity is appropriately characterized as just that, an adventure of holiness, meaning the active pursuit of deeper communion with God. And thus, the first requirement for living the adventure of holiness is placing God at the center of one's life and trusting him to lead us exactly where we need to go to grow in holiness, whatever plans we might make. Second, holiness is a matter of growth. We have seen this in Mary and Joseph today, but most especially in Luke's emphasis on the child Jesus' human growth. Even though Jesus is perfectly holy from the beginning, his human holiness, we can say, matures as he grows and learns more about his salvific mission. Third, The adventure of holiness is characterized by a tension of freely given obedience. 4. Because relationship with God is constitutive of holiness, it must be free, yet a freedom that obediently pursues our created purpose of communion with God. 4th, the virtues of humility and meekness, accepting that we do not know everything and cannot define reality for ourselves, together with a willingness to learn, provide us the strength to meet the adventure of holiness full on. 5th, while the virtues of humility and meekness provide us with the basic spiritual strengths needed to undertake this adventure, the twofold love of God and neighbor propels us forward, continually deepening the loving communion with both we have been created for. Finally, our movement forward in the adventure of holiness will always be characterized by a death and resurrection dynamic. For we will continually have to leave our old selves behind, what we thought we knew but didn't, what we mistakenly loved as a good but wasn't, and rise to purified desires and a higher understanding of what human life is all about. It is thus that in imitation of the Holy Family, the adventure of holiness will find us ever growing in wisdom and favor before God this side of eternity, until we reach our journey's end, the eternal kingdom of our loving God and Father.
Thank you for listening to this week's Gospel Reflection. For more resources, please visit us at FRESHImage.org. And remember, when you live a fresh life, you will be a breath of God's fresh, life-giving air to the world.